I'm David Healy, and I'm a medical doctor, and this is a lecture on truth, trust, and health that begins nearly 400 years ago with King Charles of England getting his head chopped off. Now, there'd been a civil war in England for a period before that and a period of chaos afterwards. And this had been all because up till then, Charles was the authority in the land, the person we depended on for truth, the person we could trust in, the person who kept order and administered justice. And we, his subjects, our job was to be holy. Now, being holy meant living a good life that would get us to heaven and a good life that would enhance the kingdom under his authority. A short while before that, however, printing presses had begun to produce Bibles, and people reading the Bibles came to the conclusion that, Charles might not be quite as adherent to truth, perhaps couldn't be trusted quite as much as they had thought, and ultimately this is what led to his head being chopped off. We found, however, pretty quickly that without an authority, that a ruler, that we had chaos, that order was needed. Some authority figure of some sort was needed, and the monarchy got restored 10 years later. Now let's jump 150 years, and this is Louis XVI of France getting his head chopped off because the French were taking a different view to what they had before about truth. They figured science was the way towards truth, and particularly in healthcare, for instance, where the people who made what we now call the medical model were in the audience seeing Louis get his head chopped off. There was proposals to organize the French hospitals on a grid to make them a machine à guérir, a treating machine. And there were the first ideas about public health, which initially meant, how do we ensure we're producing more French babies than German babies? The French were not thinking of themselves as subjects anymore. They were thinking of themselves as citizens. And Louis was slow to grasp this, and this is what led to his head being chopped off. When we talk about public health, the leading figure in history, the person to really put it on the map, was French, a man called Louis Vierme, who in the 1820s was the first to point out and give data showing poverty leads to premature deaths. He also created occupational health. And in 1835, when silk workers in Lyon were protesting and revolting against the replacement of their jobs by machines and the alienation and poverty this caused, Vierme went to look at their plight, and shortly afterwards, the Communist Party was founded in Lyon. People like Friedrich Engels in England and John Griscom in Manhattan were writing books about the condition of laboring classes at this time. And in essence, books that look political now are economic, but were public health tracts. They were all basing their ideas on VMA. And a few years later, in 1848, the original revolutionary spring happened in Europe. There were revolutions which began in France and spread to Germany and elsewhere, led by doctors. They were on the barricades. People like Marx and Engels, the economists, the philosophers, weren't. Marx and Engels rushed out a pamphlet borrowing the name communism from the Communist Party, which had been formed in Lyon. And they were saying very similar things to what the doctors who saw themselves as liberals and believers in the free market were saying. Both parties were saying everybody needs a vote. We need to educate everybody, including women. And we hope the state's going to wither away. Now, by the state, they meant the aristocracy, and it did wither away. Marx took a different view about technology, which was it's something that capitalists were making a profit out of rather, and this was the real problem with it, rather than the technology per se. Doctors view technology as part of the means that they would use, medicines and things like this, that would help them lift the masses out of misery. And this was caught very well by Rudolf Virchow, a young doctor in Berlin at the time who was on the barricades with a gun, saying medicine is a social science and politics is nothing more than medicine on a grand scale. The revolutions failed, and the French Communist Party, in disgust, emigrated from France to Illinois. At the same time, in the United States, technology was entering medicine in a new way. We'd discovered the first anesthetics and the possibility of doing operations that this opened up. But it also opened up ethical, moral problems, which is the anesthetics in their own right could kill you. And the question was, is it right to do wrong, even though good may come out of it? In the Civil War, which began in the United States a short while later, it gave the Union armies an opportunity to let a bunch of young men who had no medical training create surgery on the job. Using anesthesia, they could do operations that had never been done before. They discovered morphing syringes as an analgesic to help the operations. They were the first to use hygienic methods. They created emergency methods to triage injuries on the battlefield. And not just all that, but after the war, the Union created the first single payer system when they created a Veterans Medical Service. To this day, the Americans have more surgeons than the rest of the world, more hospitals than the rest of the world combined, and do more operations than the rest of the world combined. War was a great driver of progress in this area. In World War I, it led to further advances in surgery. It led to the creation of prostheses. It led to the creation of rehabilitation medicine. It also led the US military in particular to create propaganda. Now, they turned to Hollywood to help get the message over. Propaganda is what we now call marketing, which was critically important for the marketing of drugs and vaccines and things like that, as you'll hear. After World War II, the US military essentially created computers and gave rise to a program that led to the internet, which supports telemedicine and teleoperations, operations at a distance of thousands of miles away, because when we explore space, and fight in space, perhaps, we're going to need to be able to do operations at a distance. And the military also supported the creation of the robots that are increasingly doing the operations people have. So after World War I, there was a big change in that Franz Kafka took, not Franz Kafka, Max Weber took the opportunity to focus in on the fact that there was a communist revolution which had been building during the war and took place in Germany just after the war ended, weeks after the war ended. It was put down savagely. Its leaders were executed by the Socialist Party. But Weber, reflecting on the whole situation, said, you know, the state didn't wither away. The aristocracy was replaced by a bureaucracy. And the bureaucratic impulse, the technical impulse that lies behind bureaucracy, the procedures, they're something that's a hazard of the socialist approach towards government. He could see no limit to the explosion of bureaucratic technique, which he saw as potentially imprisoning us in an iron cage from which there'd be no easy escape. He was among the first to see that medicine was actually becoming very technological, and he couldn't see any way to get the ethics into it in a hurry. But at the same time, he thought doctors were like leaders, our leaders were like doctors, he said, which is they're the people who, unlike bureaucrats, need to take responsibility. They act and take responsibility for their actions, sometimes having to persuade a country or a person to take a medicine they may not wish to take. Looking at all this, Zygmunt Bauman a few years later said, Weber foresaw the Holocaust, the public health moment that we now call the Holocaust. Looking at all this, we can ask the question, what drives history forward? And for a long time, we thought it was God's providence that did this. And then for a couple of centuries, we thought it was individual genius, whether the genius of leaders or the genius of scientists or artists like Shakespeare. And then with Marx and then later Weber, technology and technique come into the frame. But if you look at the history of health, arguably it's the military that has done more to drive things forward. They've adopted technologies and made them efficient and techniques and made them efficient without the class interests and the profit motive Marx saw, or without the issues about equity that Weber saw. These things are things that the military don't need. They just need things to work, because good technologies and techniques create an arms race. This is very obvious with guns. The state that has the best weapons wins wars, so other people have to keep up with them. It's less obvious with health, but until the Great War, the First World War, essentially the people that won were the people who had the less people dying from disease, not from enemy combat. So it was critically important to have an arms race in health techniques as well to try and keep your soldiers functional. After World War II, we had a vacuum. With King Charles, we'd had a pillar that kept the building upright, in which we could debate issues. For several hundred years after the French Revolution, we've had a tent pole which was kept upright because there was a pull from the right and the left, which kept the pole upright and kept a place where we could debate things open. After World War II, that collapsed. We had a polarized world where issues were changing rapidly. We'd moved from justice to the rule of law after 1848, and increasingly we're moving towards regulation. We had moved from a world where people were holy to a world where people like Albert Camus thought the important virtue was authenticity, and this gave rise to a philosophy called existentialism. And people like Hannah Arendt, you see on the left. Albert Camus is there on the right, and his book, The Plague, was not a plague in the sense that COVID was. It was a plague in the sense of something was going wrong because people, the individuals, were not being authentic rather than not being holy. Hannah Arendt, whom you see on the left, was a Jew who emigrated to the United States from Germany before the war broke out, and attended the trial of German Nazis in Israel after the war, and came out with the famous phrase about the banality of evil. She came looking for monsters who had been evil, who were driving history forward, but found men who were very banal, and it raised the question of, is it bad systems rather than bad men that drive history forward? Martin Heidegger, the man in the middle there, was a German Nazi who was her lover before the war. He picked up Weber's issues after the war and was very concerned about the increasing role of technology in all of our lives, the fact that it alienated us, the fact that it was terribly difficult to bring morality of any sort into it. So we have a world here which is the world that we've been in since World War II, greatly shaped by that war, and about to be further shaped in a direction that was awfully familiar to all of us by events that were happening at that time. This is a picture which always suggests a birth to me, and there has been a birth inside the walls of the hospital behind this group. In the middle there, you see the proud father, Jean Delay, the professor of psychiatry in Paris, with a blue coat on him, and he's been congratulated, it seems, by his friends on this birth. But the picture is much less spontaneous than it looks. This is a great representation of an old order that is about to be swept away by what's happened inside the hospital. Delay is talking to his second in command, Pierre Pichot, which is on his right. His next in command after Pichot is on his left, and the others in the picture are almost irrelevant. Delay thought he should have won a Nobel Prize because he was the head of the department in which chlorpromazine, logactyl had been discovered, and from it, all of the antidepressants and antipsychotics and lots of other drugs that we have. But that's now not how things looked a few years later to the students in Paris when revolutions broke out across Europe in 1968. And here's the students marching on Delay's office, which they ransack, he has a nervous breakdown rather than gets a Nobel Prize. He never works again. It's a moment that Pierre Pichot refers to as the death of the father moment. Delay and other people have been saying, these drugs like chlorpromazine have quietened the asylum. And the response to him is that, well, this is the silence of the grave. It's not necessarily a good thing. It didn't just happen in Paris. In Tokyo, the students occupied the Department of Psychiatry for a decade, protesting against the dehumanizing force that was biological psychiatry. Now, I believe in the drugs we use and biological psychiatry, so I don't think that's quite what they were protesting about, as you're about to see. But the issue is, where are we going from here? Part of the forces that had led to this were caught in a book by Herbert Marcuse. This is one of the Bibles, the Gospels, the manifestos of 1968. Marcuse's one-dimensional man. And he's saying, look, there's something very strange going on. We used to philosophize, used to think about issues. No one's thinking about issues anymore. They're just doing things in response to numbers. And he talked about the culture industries and said, Hollywood might make programs or movies about Shakespearean plays and about something like Friends, for instance. And if more people watch Friends, that's going to be the end of Shakespeare. The idea that there's a hierarchy of good things to watch or appreciate is about to vanish. It's all going to get flattened down into one dimension. And at that time in medicine, we were beginning to prescribe by numbers. And the idea, to pick up an old phrase, money doesn't smell, was numbers don't smell. Somebody else who was thinking a little bit the same way, but saw it more positively than Marcuse, was this man, Michel Foucault, who had been part of the Communist Party in the 1950s, has left the Communist Party, and is talking about our new capacity to collect numbers and govern ourselves from the bottom up rather than the top down. We don't need monarchs or government. We can collect the numbers. And he talked about governance. He said, we don't need left or right anymore. And people like Clinton and Blair, who came after him, who are notionally on the left, have looked to an awful lot of people as though they're hard to tell where they come from. They're operating according to targets. They're technocrats. So this is a whole new world. And it's exemplified wonderfully in mental health, where up till about 1980 or thereabouts, maybe a bit later, you've got a tent pole being held up by pulls from the left and the right. You've got doctors on the one side saying drugs are useful for mental problems. And on the other side, you've got everybody else saying, oh no, we need to talk to people. But keeping the tent pole upright create a space in which at least these debates could happen. And it looked like they were actually happening between people who looked very different. You could see the doctors looked one way and everybody else, like the social workers and the psychologists, looked quite different. But you can't spot the difference in this photograph here between the psychiatrist and the psychologist. And in practice, they don't have the arguments they used to have before. They all say, the only rational thing to do is to practice according to evidence-based medicine, which I'm going to be calling largely numbers-based medicine here. And this applies even to Weight Watchers clinics, which until recently, was the place where you went to lose weight without turning to pills, which could be awfully dangerous. But now even Weight Watchers clinics are advocating, well, if the fasting and the other kind of procedures don't work, maybe you should try Ozempic. So there's been a flattening of debates. The debates that should be happening or were happening aren't happening anymore. This is what we call neoliberalism. Most people don't have a good feel for what that word means, but my point here is I think that you see neoliberalism in action more clearly in the health domain than you see it anywhere else. The factors, the driving forces in health that brought this about had happened nearly 20 years before that. in 1962, where a drug called thalidomide was being brought on the US market by one of their companies. And the usual story is it didn't get on the market because of a woman called Frances Kelsey who blocked it. This book tells you a different story, which is that wasn't true. Hundreds of children in the US had birth defects caused by thalidomide. Thousands of pregnant women took it, and the FDA went out of their way to hide all this when it all began to come to light. But it was what FDA did next that gave impetus to a numbers-based medicine more than anything else could. It led to a collapse in authority, a loss of common sense, and a turn to short-termism. And what FDA did next is you can see in the Oval Office here, where John Kennedy has just signed a new Food and Drugs Act. And he's handing the pen to Frances Kelsey. She's the woman who held things up using the 1938 Act and exercising her discretion to keep us safe, which was the point behind the regulation then, which is the point behind the regulation of food and automobiles and at the stock market, everything except drugs now, because what happened in 1962 is the new regulations asked companies to prove their drugs worked using randomized control trials, RCTs. Now, this introduction of effectiveness has trumped safety. We have a situation where people can't be as sophisticated and do two contradictory things at the same time. They either do one or the other, and essentially companies and regulators and everybody else pins their hopes on effectiveness. This leads to a situation parodied by Tom Lehrer in a 1965 song about the German rocket scientist Werner von Braun, which goes, "Once the rockets go up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department," says Werner von Braun. And that's what's happened to us as regards safety. Nobody views it as their department anymore. I mentioned randomized control trials. What are they? Well, here's the first randomized control trial run by a man called Tony Hill in the UK of streptomycin given for tuberculosis, which showed that streptomycin could work for tuberculosis. But 2 years before that, in the Mayo Clinic, a group of doctors had evaluated streptomycin without any RCT and found, yes, it worked, but not very well. And people became tolerant to it pretty quickly, and they could have serious problems like they could go deaf. This evaluation by doctors found out much more about the drug than the RCT did. And here's Tony Hill now in 1965 talking to a group of doctors saying, when it comes to evaluating a drug, your interview with the patient is the critical thing. If randomization or double blinds or placebo controls get in the way, get rid of them. Even if you do run an RCT, you need to remember at the end of the day, if it picks out something that a drug may possibly do that we didn't know about, it only gives you averages. It doesn't tell you anything about how to treat the person in front of you. And he said, have you noticed the people going around telling you to practice according to the RCTs, like they say about evidence-based medicine now, are the pharmaceutical companies. It's not your clinical colleagues. He said, at the end of the day, if we ever get to think that RCTs are the only way to evaluate a drug, we will have gone stark raving mad. So how did this end up in the 1962 Act? Well, the man responsible is there on the right. He's Louis Lassagne, who'd been the greatest enthusiast for RCTs in the United States, figuring that they could be an efficient way for companies to show their drugs worked, and it'd be a good idea if they were asked to prove that their drugs worked. And when Merrill were trying to get thalidomide on the United States market, they gave a supply of the drugs to Lassagne, who ran an RCT on it, which showed it worked as a sleeping pill and had no side effects whatsoever. So the hurdle that was being put in place to stop thalidomide happening again was one it sailed through without a problem. A few years later, you have Lasagna, an older man at this stage, saying, you know, in the 1950s, I used to go around telling people they should all be doing much more RCTs than they are doing, but I've changed my mind. Uh, RCTs and evidence-based medicine tell us nothing about how to treat the person in front of us. They just give us averages. So he's saying exactly the same thing that Tony Hill had been saying some years earlier. Advocates of RCTs say, you know, they can prove cause and effect in the way that nothing else can. The 1950s were the most remarkable decade for drugs we've ever had. You've seen the birth of chlorpromazine, from which we got the antidepressants also, and imipramine was the first of these, and doctors in Europe greeted it enthusiastically. This was all the same with antihypertensives and hypoglycemics and all sorts of other drugs, all came on the market, much better than anything we've had since, all without a randomized controlled trial in sight. In the case of imipramine, doctors said, you know, we'll be able to treat patients with melancholia who we previously had to use ECT for. This is going to replace ECT. Melancholia comes with a very high suicide risk, 80-fold higher than the risk you and I have. But within a year, doctors were also able to say, great though it is, you give it to some people and they become suicidal. You take it away and the problem clears up. You reintroduce it and the problem comes back. So imipramine can also cause some people to commit suicide. But if we put it into a placebo-controlled randomized trial for melancholia, you'd expect results that look like this, which is more people would be cured and wouldn't have a suicidal event on the drug compared to people on placebo. And this contrasts with the SSRI group of drugs, which are not particularly good antidepressants and had to be put into trials of people who are mildly depressed, who had no increased risk of going on to commit suicide. And in these trials, the SSRIs come out as, you know, it looks like they cause people to commit suicide, which in fact they do. But, you know, we also put imipramine into these trials as a comparator with the SSRIs, and the data for imipramine looks exactly the same as the data for the SSRIs. It too, in these trials, causes people to commit suicide. Now, I'm not trying to persuade you here that antidepressants cause suicide, although they can do. What I'm trying to show you is that RCTs don't work. If you've got a drug and a condition causing superficially similar problems, where people claim that RCTs eliminate confounders, they don't. In this case, which is true of most drugs and many of the problems that we get across medicine, RCTs confound the confounding. They make it worse. If you want to tease out what a drug does, you should do a drug trial. These are not drug trials, these are treatment trials. A drug trial involves giving these drugs to healthy volunteers. And in the SSRI healthy volunteer trials, you saw that these drugs cause suicidal acts, cause dependence, cause sexual dysfunction, even cause aggression and potential homicide. Companies didn't publish any of this at all. They don't have to. So in the year 2001, we have a man called Ian Hudson, who's the safety officer for GlaxoSmithKline, who make Paxil, is testifying in front of a jury in Wyoming in a case which involves a man called Don Shell, who's now dead. 48 hours after he'd begun Paxil for a mild case of insomnia, Shell shot his wife, his daughter, and his granddaughter, and then himself. His son-in-law took an action against GSK, and Hudson's telling the jury that, you know, we practice evidence-based medicine. We use RCTs to evaluate our drugs, and I can tell you for sure Paxil has no adverse effects at all, and certainly doesn't cause suicide or homicide. The jury essentially thought he was mad. They essentially said, we practice evidence-based medicine, and it's evident that, just like Hill would have said he did, it's evident that Paxil did cause this problem, and GSK are responsible for it. Now, the jury won in that case, but Hudson later became the boss of Britain's version of the FDA, and his views are entrenched on the top of FDA, WHO, EMA, etc., etc. Why? Well, there's a tremendously appealing factor to his views for regulators and people like that, which is the RCTs come with statistically significant tests, which are essentially like papal infallibility. It's saying that the expert and infallible view is that this drug works. So it's a bit like Robin Hood, able to hit the bull every time, unless perhaps a chance gust of wind can take the arrow off course. When you've got a result that's statistically significant, it implies you know what you're doing and what you're saying is solid. The trouble is, if you look at the trials that the companies have done to get antidepressants or almost any other drug on the market, and if you look at what doctors do with these drugs, which the trials supposedly say works, then the results look much more like what you see here on the right-hand side. So, we shouldn't be using statistical significance tests because they don't apply. Doctors and companies aren't expert like this. They don't have papal infallibility. It took till the 1980s for medical statisticians to start saying, it's wrong to use statistical significance tests. We should be using what they called confidence intervals instead, which had begun 200 years before because the telescopes we were using then were dodgy. You didn't always know if you were looking at one or two stars. The star you'd begun looking at might shift position because the telescope was bad. This was what was called measurement error. And Gauss said, well, if the measurements of where the stars are fall inside a confidence band, you're looking at one star. If the second measurement falls outside that band, you've got two stars. And this helped astronomy move forward. And this is what medical statisticians started saying we should be using. And this is what confidence intervals look like. Let's say you've got two drugs, the red drug and the yellow drug, and both can kill you. And this is the confidence intervals about what we know about the risks that you're going to die if you take these drugs. And the red drug is more precise, as you see. And the yellow drug looks like it might be a riskier drug to take, but we don't know as precisely as we know what the risks are for the red drugs. If you ask WHO or the Pope or FDA or whatever, which drug you should take, the books tell you you should take the yellow drug. The one we know could kill you is the red drug. But I'm telling you, and I guess most statisticians who thought about this would also tell you, take the red drug, because while we might know precisely that it can kill you, the chances that it will kill you are much less than the chances that the yellow drug will. The conventional view is that if we have a few more people in the trials of the yellow drug, we can make what we know about the yellow drug more precise. And this is where life gets fun. This is taken from a document produced by GSK when they were asked by FDA to submit the data from their adult Paxil trials to FDA for review. And I've summarized the data there on the bottom line. It looks terribly bad for Paxil. It looks like it can cause you to commit suicide or at least try to kill yourself. GSK are going to be saved, however, by randomization and statistical significance. I should have mentioned to you in the previous slide, let me just go back one. The red drug they're saying is the one you shouldn't take because essentially they're using confidence intervals to say it's statistically significantly more likely to, that we know that it can kill you. In the same way, you're going to see here how doing some more trials, adding some more patients into the mix, which should give better data on what Paxil does in people who are depressed, it produces an extraordinarily interesting effect, which is GSK did two trials in people with intermittent brief depressive disorders. They stopped the first trial because people did so poorly. They were doing much worse on Paxil. They did a further trial after that. And you see, when you add the data from the two trials together on the bottom line there, that again, Paxil doesn't look terribly good. And you don't have to believe GSK's data here. It may be much worse than this, but something magical happens when you add the bottom line to the line above it. All of a sudden, Paxil looks like it protects you against suicide. And Ian Hudson can say to the jury, we've got no evidence that our drug causes people to commit suicide. But This happens or can happen every single time you've got a heterogeneous condition in medicine. And that's when you've got what looks like the same illness, like major depressive disorder, or breast cancer, or Parkinson's disease, or back pain, or diabetes, dementia, almost any medical condition. On the inside, people know these are not all one illnesses. There's a bunch of illnesses which look fairly similar, but we figure are caused by different things, and the right treatment for each of these is going to be very, very different. When you've got that kind of state, then if you give a pill like Paxil, you can have very different outcomes in each of the treatment groups, and you can use a problem that a drug causes to hide a problem that a drug causes. I could have told GSK back then, this is what you need to do to hide the suicide risks that you're trying to hide on Paxil. And let me show you how this affects confidence intervals, which is the red line, the red drug up there now is the data for the major depressive disorder trials, which almost for sure show Paxil causes people to commit. So that the actual data do show it for sure. But when we've now added, the conventional wisdom is if you add a few more patients in, you're going to give a much more precise figure for the red line confidence intervals. In this case, we've added in only 3 patients for with IBDD for every 100 patients that's got major depressive disorder. And we have a much more precise estimate, but it's one that's shifted right over from the risk side of the line to the benefit side of the line. No statistics books tell you that this can happen. This shows you that we don't know what we're doing. You know, we in a sense have much more precise data, but it points to our ignorance, not our knowledge. And what this means, it can be called very simply in the next slide, which is that statistical tests don't tell us anything about reality. They're models, and measurement error in the case of a drug given to a person is not the same as using a telescope to look at stars. Many years ago, I was in a pharmacology practical with a colleague, and I had to give her a beta blocker, which reliably slows heart rates, but in her case, it increased the heart rate. If we included her in a trial, her increase in heart rate would disappear. So confidence intervals are a model. They don't tell us about reality. They're a model like the signs of the zodiac you see here are the models we use to map the COVID pandemic. These models give us an opportunity to have conversations, but they're not tests for reality. But as I say, in practice, medical journals and regulators all assume that they are. And they act as though they're on infallible grounds when they claim things about their drugs working or not having side effects. Now, I've talked about regulators. There was an old phrase which was, if you eat sausages, you don't want to visit a sausage factory. If you're a Catholic and believe in the system, you don't want to visit the Vatican and see what goes on. So I'm going to take you into the Holy of Holies these days, which is places like FDA, and it's going to shake your faith. These are the suicidal events that occurred in the trials of fluoxetine and paroxetine and sertraline, the SSRIs we know and love. And you've seen a bit of this slide before, but what you're seeing now as well is under the word screening, the run-in phase for this trial, which is where you've removed people from the previous drugs that they're on before they get randomized to either the new drug, the SSRI, or the placebo. Now, this screening phase, as you can see, is very risky. It's only a week or 2, but a lot of events can happen during that phase. When the data went into FDA, the company said, well, people weren't on any drug during that phase, which is the same as placebo, isn't it? Well, they were in withdrawal, but it's not the same as placebo. even when companies did maneuvers like this, which they've done in their trials, which breached FDA regulations, there were still more events on the SSRIs than in the placebo arm of these trials. It's just they weren't statistically significant. So people like Ian Hudson and FDA could say, well, there isn't a problem here. When this all came to light, however, and companies were asked, this is a breach of regulations. What's going on here? They said, well, FDA saw what we were doing and didn't object to it. So what's FDA up to? Well, in the 1980s, when the SSRIs were being licensed, the man in charge of the whole process was Paul Lieber, who said, the trials companies have been doing up to this, where they compare their new drug to an old drug, don't tell us if this drug really works. You've got to compare it to a placebo before we, the regulators, are able to say, yes, we can tick a box, this drug works. The problem was when the companies compared their drugs to placebo, it was very hard for SSRIs to beat placebos because they're really not antidepressants. So when it came to Zoloft, the FDA and Lieber had a particular problem, which was the results for Zoloft were terribly poor. And we end up with Lieber saying, the regulations, the letter of the law says there's got to be 2 positive trials. Even if a company does 100 trials and 98 are negative, if there's 2 positive trials, we can license this drug and say that the company can use the word antidepressant. What FDA are doing is they're being bureaucrats. They're not leaders. This is not the rule of law. This is regulation. And in regulation, usually what happens with food and drugs is that FDA get companies to do assays to prove that their chocolate contains a certain amount of cocoa solids or the butter contains a certain amount of animal fats, or in the assay that, that there's a fall in a rating scale score for depression. It's not about saving lives, and it's not about getting you back to work. It's not about, in the case of chocolate, being able to say this is a good chocolate, or in the case of butter, saying butter is good for you. Regulators don't do that. They just say, well, yes, the company has done the assay, and they can now use the word chocolate or butter are antidepressant. I said to you that in the case of an antidepressant, the companies are using rating scales because it would take too long to do a study where we looked at whether more people die or not at the placebo compared with the new drug. But across medicine, in the case of the antidepressant trials and almost all other drugs that get brought on the market these days, there's very few drugs where there's any evidence that they save lives or get people back to work. All of the evidence is more people die on the proposed new treatment than in the placebo arm of these trials. So what's going on here? Well, that's a good question. And I'm going to make the question even worse, which is this. When a company gets a license to use a word like antidepressant or laxative, as you see here, there's 4 different kinds of constipation and 4 different kinds of laxative. And the clinical skill used to be being able to pick out the right kind of therapeutic principle for the constipation problem you had. These are not magic bullets, they're therapeutic principles. If we pick the wrong one, and doctors used to be good at this, and even mothers looking after children used to be good at this, but if a company gets a license to use the word laxative, we have a laxative, their interests are to make sure that everybody who's got constipation gets their drug. They don't mind if you get all of the other kinds as well, provided you get theirs. But this is a recipe for treatment-resistant constipation. Maybe not too bad in the case of constipation, but it's also what happens these days when we use antihypertensives or hyperglycemics or almost any drug in medicine, like for instance, the antidepressants. This point is true of all of them. There's 4 different kinds of antidepressants. There's the SSRI Serenics. There's the vigilance-enhancing norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. There's the tonic drugs which improve your appetite and sleep, like mirtazapine. There's the drugs like imipramine, which are treatments for melancholia. Get the wrong drug, and you're on the road to treatment-resistant depression. And the wrong drugs are often the SSRIs these days, which create a complex chemical imbalance that we don't know what's going on, and we don't we aren't able to treat, and you may have this for months or years, and maybe a desperate state with no one able to treat it, and an increasing proportion of people applying for medical assistance in dying, and an increasing number of countries saying, well, yes, we think you should be let die given how grim you say things are. Something else happens with FDA approval, which is they create an Alice in Wonderland type situation. They put a label on a drug, which is a bit like the drink me label here, which Alice finds irresistible. In the same way, white educated women across the Western world, after thalidomide, stopped taking drugs during pregnancy and moved on to taking, saying that we shouldn't take soft cheeses or processed meats or anything like this, but are taking an increasing number of drugs, of which the antidepressants are the ones they take most commonly, and an increasing number of vaccines, because they come with a label from FDA saying this works, take it. There's a very famous phrase which triggered the French Revolution, which was men are born free, but everywhere in chains. A friend has doctored this for me to chains have been replaced by chemical straitjackets. And the security guy there is saying, there must be a way of getting them born in chemical straitjackets. And I think this is the point that the students worldwide in 1968 foresaw, not just that the drugs for nervous problems were going to be used much too widely, but everything was going to be used much too widely. People were going to be born in chemical straitjackets. Now, I mentioned assays, and they're different to randomized controlled trials. What you see there on the left is what might look like a report on a randomized controlled trial. It's not. This is a company randomized controlled assay. It is randomized and there are some controls, but it's an assay, not a trial. It's designed to meet FDA standards and get Paxil on the market for GSK. This is the most famous RCA in medicine. It appears in the journal with the highest impact factor with an authorship line to die for, but it was fraudulent. The real author isn't there. And where the article claims the drug works and is safe, in fact, the company knew beforehand that it didn't work and wasn't safe. And this fraud charge gave some of us a chance to get hold of the data behind the trial. And this has been written up in the article you see on the right, showing what we think is what the article should have said. We don't claim that we're right the way GSK claimed. We say, look, when you have the data, people may come to a variety of different interpretations, but it's very hard to see how you came to GSK's interpretation, in particular, children becoming suicidal at a rate of 1 in 7. Now, a year after the randomized controlled assay came out, GSK applied to FDA to get Paxil approved for teenagers who are depressed. And they told FDA, we've done 3 trials in this age group for kids who are depressed, all negative. And FDA are responding, they're approving Paxil, GSK to claim Paxil works for children who are depressed. They're responding saying, we agree with you that these 3 trials were negative. We also agree with your proposal that we shouldn't mention this in the label of the drug. What on earth is going on here? Before I tell you, I should also tell you, a short while before this, FDA had approved Prozac for children who are depressed in the same fashion on the basis of negative studies where Prozac was unsafe for teenagers who are depressed. Here's the published articles on the adult trials of the antidepressants that we know and love. Anyone looking at these, the white boxes point to the drug working and being safe would race out and put themselves on one of these drugs. But FDA, as you've seen, sometimes get to see something that looks different to the published articles. And this is what FDA saw when they looked at those trials, or were told by the companies, which is there was 1/3 of the trials that were negative completely, and didn't get published at all. And 1/3 of the positive trials were negative, but got published as positive. When you take them out of the mix and put them back where they should be, you find that over half of the trials, the adult and children trials combined, these drugs were negative. The results were negative. Most articles you read these days say evidence-based medicine says the antidepressant you should take is Zoloft. The data for that are on the 3rd column on the right, 3rd column from the right, And you see, there's only one positive trial there. FDA is supposed to have 2 positive trials before they license a drug. They didn't have it. Zoloft looks like the one drug you really shouldn't be having. So let me take you from the Holy of Holies to something that the Holy of Holies, God, deals with. At least that's what St. Augustine thought. Way back in 400 AD, he had this famous saying, "Our hearts are made for thee, O Lord, and cannot rest until they find their rest in thee." There's a restlessness and discontent at the heart of all of us. We don't know what life is about. We're trying to find a course that keeps us and everyone else in reasonably good shape. And these days, that's caught by this cartoon, which rather than trying to be holy and saying our hearts are made for thee, O Lord, people are trying to be healthy. They don't want to feel the way they're feeling and think, well, I'm not sick. And pharmaceutical companies have been, as of 1980, have been able to capitalize on this, literally capitalize, in the sense of make money out of, without thinking about it militarily. You're going to make money, but are you going to keep people alive? From a capitalist point of view, keeping people alive is not necessarily a good business model, because if you cure them, they're not going to take your drug and you're not going to make money. So as of 1980, companies began treating your numbers, promoting their drugs to treat numbers in people who didn't have an illness at all. And they were able to give us all chronic medical conditions with our blood pressure and all sorts of things, have us on multiple different drugs at the same time. This led to a change. Healthcare was all about us bringing problems we had to the doctor or the hospital who helped cure us and help us live the life we wanted to live. Now they became health services. They're going to start screening us and give us problems. They'll ask us in rather than us go to them and give us problems that we didn't know we had beforehand. And this all began, in essence, the story begins 150 years ago when we introduced weighing scales for people. And shortly after, about 10 years after the French began using weighing scales to weigh themselves, a new disorder was described, which was anorexia nervosa. People used to fast in order to be holy. They began fasting in order to be authentic, and now they fast in order to be healthy. But when the weighing scales migrated into drugstores, they came with plates on them giving your ideal weight for your sex and height, and eating disorders mushroomed. In the 1960s, weighing scales migrated into all our bathrooms, and eating disorders exploded in the Western world, but not in parts of the world that didn't have weighing scales. And companies recognized this and began to encourage doctors to measure everything, to have a whole load of instruments and take blood tests left, right, and center when you go to see them. And they don't ask your consent to check all these things out, but they give you problems that, you'd be better off not knowing about, partly because when this all began, the first proposal was we need to treat hypertension, raise blood pressure before you get a stroke, rather than just trying to treat you when you have a stroke. And that makes sense with the original proposal, which was we need to persuade you to stop taking salt. It makes much less sense when you're totally healthy. You're likely not going to have a stroke ever, even though your blood pressure is up, if we're encouraging you to take a pill, which can cause serious problems in its own right, as osteoporosis brings out beautifully. In almost the same year that anorexia nervosa is described in France, osteoporosis is first described. It's a rare condition that affects women over the age of 50, but it is awfully rare, or was until the 1980s, when companies began producing bisphosphonate drugs, which thicken up bones, and they gave away free bone scanners. And all of a sudden, you have 1/3 of the women over 50, it looks like, have some bone thinning and can be encouraged to contemplate taking an osteoporosis drug, not thinking that abnormally thickening bones might be not so good a thing to do. It leads to much more severe fractures that can incapacitate people in a way osteoporosis never did. And the other aspect to all this is, health service companies are told if you use our pills, you're going to have less medical burden in the sense that people aren't going to end up in hospital. But in fact, they do end up in hospital, but also the health service company gets the free screening instruments and then employs the staff essentially to sell the drug by doing the screening, and employs the auditors to monitor the data, and then the managers to try and put the service right, which must be going wrong with all these serious fractures because doctors aren't keeping to the guidelines which tell them to use these drugs. Guidelines based on a fake literature, which the companies producing the osteoporosis drugs have got published. And this numbers issue has moved on to, it became awfully clear in the COVID pandemic, which was we got the ability to treat a population like a person. We produce figures for the population, and we produce a dashboard nervosa, which turns people against each other. If I spot you doing something that I think is going to make the figures for the country worse, I'm not going to be awfully pleased with you. I mean, that may be my view about you doing things that are going to make the figures worse. We don't know if you are, but this is I mean, we've seen an extraordinary example of the power of numbers with the COVID pandemic. Whatever your views are on the pandemic or the vaccines, the dashboard aspect to it was probably the most interesting aspect. And that's led to this marvelous Loinic cartoon that I haven't had to doctor at all. You have a man saying to his partner, our way of life has been threatened by a dark force. We must defend our way of life. She asks reasonably, what is this dark force that threatens our way of life? And he says, it's our way of life that's threatening our way of life. We've entered a post-truth era where it's very hard to know. I mean, there's no truth around the place. You can't believe any of the people. We've got a ton of numbers, and you know, you can produce some numbers, I can produce other numbers. There's no way forward here. There's conspiracies on all sides. Everybody who thinks that you don't agree with their numbers, thinks that you're doing it for some strange motive. It's hard to get consensus. And this has become very clear lately, where one of the most solid findings in all of the social sciences, there's 600 or more studies saying that people in middle years have less well-being than younger people or older people. They're much more likely to be collecting disability benefits than any other age group. And that was true till about 2010, when things began to change. We now have a situation where young people are collecting more disability benefits than people in their middle years, from 35 on to kind of 50 or so. What's going on? What's produced this kind of situation? Well, let me take you back before it began, which is to this Simpsons cartoon, which the way things were, Bart comes along saying, this is the worst day of my life. Homer has the authority to be able to say to Bart, no, this is the worst day of your life so far. It's going to make you more resilient in the longer run and be able to cope with even worse days. Trouble is now, if the cartoon was to be redone now, Bart would fish a rating scale out of his back pocket and say, Dad, but look at my rating scale scores. And Homer would have no option but to take him along to a doctor. If Bart had the same experience as this girl here, it'll be interesting to let you know what was going to happen to him. But I should tell you first, this article came out in the New York Times, the left-leaning paper in New York, and essentially the New York Post, the right-leaning paper, was saying exactly the same thing the same weekend, which was, this is true of all our teens, and, there was general agreement, this isn't a great idea. So if Bart was brought along, what would happen to him if it was the same as this girl would be he'd be put on an SSRI, he'd maybe become suicidal. He'd be told, this means you're really bipolar, you need a mood stabilizer. First of all, an anticonvulsant mood stabilizer, and when that didn't work, maybe more anticonvulsants or an antipsychotic thrown in. And when he comes back on the antipsychotic, he might say, I'm not able to focus quite as well. So he'd be given a rating scale for ADHD, and that would show that he isn't able to focus all that well. And the doctor would say to him, you've got ADHD as well. I need to give you an ADHD drug, which pulls exactly the opposite way on the dopamine system to the antipsychotic. This is as crazy as me getting you to stand up on a weighing scale and putting, a 1 stone dumbbell or half a stone dumbbell in your left hand and half a stone dumbbell in your right hand and looking down at the weighing scale and say, oh, you're a stone overweight, you need to take Ozempic. It's as crazy as that. Rather than just taking the drugs out of the system, the weights off your hands, which would be the sensible way forward. And books like Jonathan Haidt's The Anxious Generation and economists like Danny Blanchflower and all have been picking up on all this, saying it's down to mobile phones, it's down to smartphones, and people are going on. I mean, young people are just not in a state of well-being because of these phones, partly because they're being cyber bullied. Now, I don't think the cyberbullying is the case. I think you can be bullied simply by the likes and dislikes of Facebook. It's a bit like a weighing scales. I had 50,000 likes last week. I've only got 49,000 this week. Something's going badly wrong with my life. I need to try and put it right. If there's bullying, if there's a more nasty kind of bullying, what's not been taken into account by people like Haidt and Blanchflower is people are on SSRIs, an increasing number of teenagers and all are on these drugs. They used to watch videos of ISIS beheading people in Iraq some 5 or 10 years ago or whenever it was. And they said they were doing it in order to feel. They are so numbed by these drugs, some people at least, that they can't feel anything unless they see something shocking. I think it's quite possible that you have some people who are being terribly nasty on mobile phones in order to be able to feel because of the drugs they're on. But whatever is going on here, one of the other things is the companies learned that these are platforms where they could encourage you to monitor your number of steps, the quality of your sleep, every flicker of an emotion you are having. And if you're straying at all from, the optimal point or how good you were before, we have the treatment, or we can direct you towards the treatment that you need to put this right because you're worth it. And these treatments will all be drugs, which are raising the issues. We moved from being subjects to citizens to, in the last 40, 50 years, we've become consumers of health products. But what we're getting at this stage, at this point, where so much of who we are is shaped by the social media we're linked to, we're essentially becoming cyborgs. Part of us is in a virtual domain rather than in our own bodies. Now, how are we going to put this right? Well, part of the problem with where things have gone wrong was picked out by Louis Lassagne, who intervened when people were claiming in the early 80s that randomized controlled trials are the way to know what a drug does, not just the good things about a drug, but the adverse effects too. And after he stopped laughing, because he had done the trial which showed thalidomide had no adverse effects at all, he said, this just isn't true at all. The best way to work out about the adverse effects of a drug are detailed clinical interviews, taking the patient's point of view into account. 7 years after this exchange here, in Boston, 3 clinicians reported on 6 patients they'd given Prozac to and said, look, this drug causes people to commit suicide. And they were taking the same approach that Lassagne had outlined, challenge, de-challenge, and re-challenge, close clinical interviews, and in particular, listening closely to the testimony of the person on the drug. Within a year, there were about 20 papers reporting the same thing from Yale and elsewhere, saying we've seen exactly the same thing that you've outlined here. So this is evidence-based medicine, and it proved beyond a shadow of doubt Prozac and other SSRIs can make you suicidal. The company response was in this article that appeared in the BMJ saying, we've analyzed our controlled trials, and there's no evidence from them that, Prozac can cause people to commit suicide. And they went on to say the plural of anecdote, as everyone knows, is not data. It's the disease depression, not our drug, that's causing this. And the challenge to people was, are you going to believe the science or are you going to believe the anecdotes? They were spinning the science as the company trials. And this is the article that creates evidence-based medicine. You need to know that the original of the phrase was the plural of anecdote is data, and Google wouldn't work if that weren't the case. The company in this case and other SSRIs had done healthy volunteer trials showing people becoming suicidal on their drug, and what disease these healthy volunteers had, I don't know. But you've also seen me show you how the data was manipulated, how it wasn't ever generated to inform clinical practice. It's an artifact. The companies manipulated it in all kinds of ways. So my challenge to you is, are you going to believe the artifact of numbers-based medicine, or are you going to believe the evidence-based medicine that you saw in the previous trial and that Lasagna and Hill and other people advocate? The company essentially in the public domain with the media and things like that kind of supporting them, the New York Times and liberal media, have essentially cancelled the views of doctors and patients, people on the drugs having problems. When we report these things, we now find ourselves cancelled. We who are being scientific and offering the best evidence are being trumped by a fake literature. Even when FDA get around to putting black box warnings on these drugs that they can cause you to commit suicide, the response at this stage of doctors and the powers that be to the black box warnings is they treat them like people with a serious nut allergy treat labels saying may contain nuts. They just figure it's a company or regulators covering their back. It's not something that anyone needs to pay any heed to. We're in a position where, there is no truth out there. This is a document that's just come out on preventing suicide in the United States. It should be something we can trust. I don't trust it. They talk about shared decision making and informed consent. Well, you've been informed about what company trials showed. You've not been informed about anything else. It talks about collaborating with people with lived experience, but it's very clear they don't want your lived experience if you're going to say that my experience is I've been harmed by a drug. It's not shared decision making. It's really you being told the only rational thing to do based on the evidence is that you take this drug. And everybody from Joe Biden to the Pope down, including the liberal media, the New York Times, the Guardian, et cetera, are all behind this. It's terribly hard. I mean, I find it terribly difficult to find someone to trust or any truth out there. I'm not going to leave you with that. I'm going to tell you who you can trust and where you can find some truth. But one of the other problems is, part of what I'm going to say is, you and I working together is where the truth and the trust lies in terms of you. But on the other side, we increasingly have people like FDA turning to what they claim is big data. And FDA are claiming that we've got all the company trials, we've got reports of adverse events, we've got all the insurance claims, all the health data that's out there is on our computers, and including all the data from your wearables that tell us about your sleep and your emotional flickers and things like this. With so much big data, we're the people to crack the problem. But this is like quantum physics, where despite all of the data, the quantum physicists can't tell where a particle is. They can't tell whether Schrodinger's cat is alive or dead. And big data like this can't tell you whether you've been drug injured or not. But a doctor can, or you can. What we've got here is a hazard of models. And what you've got on the next slide is a moral hazard, a hazard linked to morals. The woman in the middle is a pilot. And if she has a near miss, she reports it, and the system changes things because they know she and her colleagues won't fly if they don't put things right, because they know, she knows that, you might die if things aren't put right, but she also knows she's going to die. So she has an incentive to keep you safe. The woman on the right is a financier in charge of Citibank. And in the financial crisis, what we said about the people giving us financial instruments and mortgages was they were in a state of moral hazard. They had no incentive to tell us that they wouldn't buy this particular financial instrument, or they wouldn't take out this mortgage because there's every chance it's going to explode in our face and destroy our lives. The lady on the left is a doctor who in the same way is in a state of moral hazard. She should know that she's operating on the basis of a fake literature, which is built into guidelines and things like that. But she's got no incentive to tell you she wouldn't take it or give the same drugs to any of her family. Because she consumes the drug. The pharmaceutical industry see her as the consumer, not you, and they ensure that she doesn't have a thought in her head that's not put there by them or their competitors. She consumes by putting the drug in your mouth, which explodes and can destroy your life. The only way she's not going to get her bonuses and her pay is if she takes your side and warns you beforehand, or takes your side after the event and agrees with you that the drug has caused the injury you now have. And this has resulted in a pharmaceuticalization crisis, a polypharmacy pandemic to rival the financial crisis of 2007, when we had money chasing money as poverty rises, drugs chase drugs now as life expectancy falls and reproductive replacement rates fall. How are we going to put this right? Well, part of the answer lies with the head being chopped off here. This was a few years before Charles had his head chopped off. This is Walter Raleigh getting his head chopped off because he's supposedly been too close to some Europeans. After his death, the English legal system recognized that he had been convicted on the basis of hearsay. That is, on the basis of things people said he had done and said he had said, but these people were not prepared to come into court to be examined and cross-examined. So the system changed and said a jury can only come to a verdict based on what they see being examined and cross-examined in front of them. If it's not right in front of them, then they pay no heed to what was called hearsay. And company trials are hearsay. The patients don't always exist. FDA and other people don't have the data. It cannot be brought into court. Even the people on the authorship line who seem to be the people who wrote the study up don't know what the data looks like. They didn't have the data ever. They've never seen any of the patients. If I'm treating you and you have a problem on a drug and we report it to FDA, they remove our names. But if we report it in a medical journal with our names on it, that's evidence because we can be brought into court to be examined and cross-examined, even if it's just a case report of a problem that you and I agree is the only way to explain it is the drug caused it. And 10 years after Charles had his head chopped off, Charles II became king. One of the first things he did was to institute the Royal Society. And they had exactly the same ground rules as the English legal system had, which was, we're not going to be dealing in philosophy or theology or things like that. We're going to get a bunch of people, 12 people, Christians, Hindus, Muslims, atheists, Jews, get them to leave the Bibles and the biases at the door, just come in and look at an experiment taking place in front of them and come to a consensus view about the best way, well, first of all, what they're seeing, and then the best way to explain it. This is the way science proceeded for 300 years after this. Nothing to do with data, nothing to do with statistics and tests like that. And that leads to a situation we've got like this, which is we now have a polypharmacy pandemic with people on up to 10 different drugs, many of which can explode if you try to move them. In terms of the doctor here trying to treat you, the patient, on all these bombs, it's important. First of all, you need to know that there's never going to be a controlled trial or a guideline that will help her or you come to the right answer. Her experience may help. The fact that she can consult colleagues about this situation may help. But, you know, she may have colleagues who have had people on exactly the same drugs you're on, but they react very differently to the way you're reacting to them. The key person, the key pilot in terms of getting you to where you want to get is you. The key researcher is you. You know things about what the drugs are doing to you. You know the drugs that look like they might be a problem trying to stop because of missed doses and things like that. That's the reality that you bring to at the table. And this is a situation where, like a pilot, we need to respect reality. We do not want to operate on the basis of models. Now, I mentioned a pilot. One of the curious things about all this, and I've said big tech is a problem, but AI is on the horizon, and most people see that as part of big tech. It's a very different kind of big tech. It's not about just collecting masses and masses of stuff, although what we've got at the moment does look like that. But if an AI can ever learn, it'll be operating in a binary way. Do I choose 1 or 0? And the 1 or 0, the options you will have to choose between are a doctor who adheres to the guidelines and the fake literature where the patients don't exist and the articles are fraudulent. Should the AI believe the decisions he makes, the numbers-based medicine approach, or should they go with the relationship-based medicine, which is you and I working closely together with a track record between us of mostly getting things right and getting things right in terms of either the benefits or the harms, sometimes getting things wrong and things can go badly wrong and kill us, but less likely to go badly wrong and kill us than the numbers-based medicine dude. My view is that AI that can learn will have no option but to support a relationship-based medicine rather than a numbers-based medicine. And this is the final slide. It brings us back to telescopes. The James Webb telescope. We don't need models and confidence intervals anymore, which helped us once upon a time. This is the telescope that helps us pick out individual stars in a way we couldn't have done before. And this is what science is all about. It's about an individuality which lets us pick out individual stars or individual genes in our genome, or individual patients when they come along to see us. You might have what looks like the same illness and be on just the same pills as the person I've seen previously, but in fact be reacting totally differently. And I need to bear that in mind. In terms of helping you, I, and you to some extent, have been sold an idea that objectivity, which is important that I bring this to the table, stems from using chance to control bias. This is the statistical test approach. In fact, the history of science points very strongly to the fact that we progress by using bias to control chance. Your bias and mine coming to a consensus between us is the thing that's most likely to help you. And it's something that we need to be advocates for to try and ensure that this happens much more than it's happening now. This is the thing that we can't let be cancelled. This is the thing that we can learn working closely together to trust each other. And it will give us maybe not the absolute truth, but a path towards a better truth than the one that you've been operating from, and I and other doctors have been operating from up till this. Thank you.